In the dominant historical narrative, codified by Cold War historians and disseminated through decades of popular culture, the seeds of Stalinism were planted by the practices of Bolshevism itself, sealing the revolution's fate before it even began. As Orlando Figes, whose work otherwise emphasizes that there were a number of decisive moments both before and during 1917 when Russia might have followed a more democratic course, asserts that from the October insurrection and the establishment of a Bolshevik dictatorship to the Red Terror and the Civil War, with all its consequences for the evolution of the Soviet regime, there is a line of historical inevitability. As humorous as it is to see a serious historian argue that an absolute monarchy possessed greater democratic potential than revolutionary communism, his core thesis, that Leninism was merely the larval stage of Stalinism, is one often conceded by the modern left. Eager to distance themselves from 20th century crimes, many contemporary socialists affirm that the Bolshevik project was fatally authoritarian from the start, thus surrendering the narrative that the October Revolution inevitably led to tyranny. This capitulation stems from a failure of political nerve, not historical evidence. The Cold War axiom that the Bolsheviks were a monolithic sect gave way to a sober acknowledgement of the widespread support enjoyed by the Bolsheviks with the rise of social history in the 1970s. It's a bitter irony that while the Academy has moved on from the myth of a sinister master plan, much of the contemporary left still timidly clings to it. To sustain this myth, critics must avoid precisely the kind of concrete examination of Bolshevik practice that modern historians undertake. Instead, in a sleight of hand that borders on the absurd, they routinely bypass the actual revolution and locate the seeds of tyranny in a pamphlet written a full 15 years before the Bolsheviks took power, Lenin's 1902 work, What Is to Be Done. As Lars Lee summarizes, the book was viewed by Cold War scholars as a profound theoretical and organizational innovation, the charter document of Bolshevism, and the ultimate source of Stalinism. Nothing could be further from the truth. Lenin was not drafting a constitution for empire or a blueprint for governance. The text is silent on administration. He was writing a manual for how activists could survive and operate under the draconian yoke of czarist law. Hardly proposing a party of a new type, Lenin's explicit model was the mass German Social Democratic Party, the SPD. He simply argued that its open democratic structure was impossible to replicate under the nose of the czarist secret police. He was describing the need for a core of stable, full-time activists, analogous to trade union officials in democratic countries, who could maintain the party's infrastructure while also evading arrest. In this context, his call for revolutionaries by trade was hardly a demand for an elite priesthood to rule over the workers, but a functional necessity for a clandestine organization. Similarly, his famous polemic regarding the limitations of spontaneity was not a permanent theory of worker incompetence, but a specific weapon to use against the economists. This faction argued that workers should restrict themselves to spontaneous economic struggles over wages, effectively ceding the political fight against the Tsar to the liberals. Lenin attacked this reliance on spontaneity not to silence the class, but to ensure its struggle rose to the level of a battle for state power. Lenin himself later explicitly rejected these formulations, stating he did not hold by them as general principles and that they were merely controversial corrections to the limited ideas of his opponents at the time. The most decisive proof that what is to be done was a tactical expedient rather than a totalitarian blueprint lies in Lenin's own actions. The moment the 1905 revolution cracked the autocracy and made open organization possible, Lenin abandoned the pamphlet strictures entirely. He became the leading advocate for democratizing the party, demanding they open the gates wide to mass worker recruitment and hold elections for committees, proposals that were famously resisted by others in the party. If What Is to Be Done was the founding document of Bolshevism and the ultimate proof of Lenin's dictatorial intent, it is strange that its author was the first to scrap it when the police state receded. Just as the standard narrative caricatures what is to be done, it completely mischaracterizes what was actually done. The myth of a monolith crumbles the moment one examines the party's actual organizational life. As even the anti-communist historian Robert Service admits, the image of a tightly knit bunch of inveterate conspirators, so sedulously cultivated by their enemies, was a cruel mockery of their real condition. In March 1917, for instance, when Lenin sent his urgent letters from far away from exile in Switzerland, the editors of Pravda, including Stalin, were horrified by his demands for an immediate break with the provisional government. In a flagrant act of insubordination, not to mention cowardice, they refused to publish 4 of Lenin's 5 letters. The one they did print was heavily censored, stripped of its sharpest attacks to fit the editor's own counter-revolutionary policy of providing critical support to the new regime. This isn't the behavior of subordinates blindly following their leader, but of independent political actors confident enough to silence their leader when they wrongly believed he was out of touch. Even as the revolution approached, the party never conformed to the monolith of myth. When the Central Committee voted to launch the uprising, 2 of Lenin's closest lieutenants, Zinoviev and Kamenev, did not merely vote against this, they publicly denounced the plan in Maxim Gorky's non-party newspaper, effectively leaking the date of the revolution to the enemy. Lenin furiously denounced them as strikebreakers and demanded their immediate expulsion from the party. In a totalitarian party, such treason would result in execution. In a bureaucratic one, at least expulsion. Yet the Bolshevik Central Committee, asserting its independence, refused Lenin's demand. Not only were Zinoviev and Kamenev retained, but mere days later they were entrusted with leading the new Soviet state. This was a party where the dictator could be openly defied on the most crucial question of the revolution, yet failed to be removed. Even when politics was at its most chaotic and the need for united action greater than ever, during the revolution itself, controversy was the lifeblood of the Central Committee, as even Service acknowledges. The debate over if Russia should withdraw from the First World War nearly tore the party apart. Rather than dictatorially silencing his opposition, Lenin had to argue until he was hoarse, threatening resignation just to force a vote. At the height of this crisis, the Moscow Regional Bureau of the party went so far as to vote a resolution of no confidence in the Central Committee, an act of open defiance. Lenin's response is worth quoting in full. In all this, there is not only nothing appalling, but also nothing strange. It is completely natural for comrades who differ sharply with the Central Committee on the issue of a separate peace to reprimand the Central Committee sharply and express their conviction on the inevitability of a split. All of this is the legal right of the members of the party, and this is fully understandable. The concept of a central command issuing precise directives to the puppet-like periphery is no more applicable to the Bolsheviks' post-October governance. Local committees overwhelmed the center with desperate appeals for rules and guidance, frequently receiving only administrative silence in return. N.P. Gorbanov, the 25-year-old appointed secretary of the Council of People's Commissars, later recalled taking the post without receiving a single instruction from Lenin. Confessing he knew absolutely nothing about his duties, he was forced to commandeer a typewriter and hunt and peck the state's new decrees with 2 fingers because no professional typist could be found. Scrambling to secure the most basic tools of bureaucracy, the Bolsheviks were hardly in a position to dictatorially command such a chaotic, swelling movement as the revolution. Nor does the historical record support the claim that the Bolsheviks were ideologically committed to a single-party state. In the months following the revolution, they governed in coalition with the left socialist revolutionaries, who held critical posts, including the People's Commissariats for Justice and Agriculture. Furthermore, the Bolshevik government remained constitutionally answerable to the Central Executive Committee of the Soviets, a multi-party parliamentary body where Mensheviks, left SRs, and anarchists debated and occasionally blocked Bolshevik decrees. This oversight represented a genuine democracy within the new state, where the executive was frequently compelled to justify its actions to a broader socialist assembly. This coalition collapsed not due to Bolshevik intolerance, but because the left SRs, unwilling to accept withdrawal from the First World War, launched an armed insurrection against the government in July 1918. Even in the wake of this uprising, left SR representatives retained their government posts on the condition that they repudiate the coup. One-party rule arose only after the left SRs, torn apart by the failure of their sabotage, broke up. Not even the emergence of a one-party state fully extinguished political life. The shift to a one-party system meant only that organized opponents of the revolution were barred from holding office. Within this framework, democracy remained vibrant. The general Russian public continued to vote for Soviet deputies and, as Sheila Fitzpatrick notes, After coming to power, the once intransigent Bolsheviks came to accommodate and even institutionalize diversity of opinion. Prominent factions like the military opposition fiercely challenged Trotsky's use of former Tsarist officers, while the democratic centralists and the workers' opposition openly criticized the leadership's bureaucratization and economic policies. As the anarchist Viktor Sergei remembered in 1930, nobody was afraid to contradict Lenin or to criticize him. His authority was so little imposed, the democratic manners of the revolution still so natural, that it was a matter of course for any revolutionary, no matter how recent a recruit, to express himself frankly in the presence of the man who headed the party and the state. If the Bolshevik Party was indeed this chaotic, prone to insubordination, and lacking in administrative control, a critical question arises. What of Lenin's infamous democratic centralism? Hell, how did the party function at all? The answer lies in recognizing that democratic centralism was not a static set of rules, but a living relationship. The tension and conflict that many critics identify as a weakness were, in reality, the engine of the party's strength. A revolutionary organization operates by existing in a state of constant friction, both with the masses of the working class and within its own ranks. Without this tumultuous democracy, without the noise of the rank and file pressing against the leadership, the party becomes blind. It loses the ability to learn from the class, to debate its own experiences, and to formulate policies that actually reflect reality. However, democracy alone is not enough. To lead effectively, the party must take this raw, chaotic feedback and systematize it into coherent action. This is the centralism aspect. The discipline to execute a decision once the debate has concluded. But crucially, this discipline was not imposed by force or by a police apparatus. It was derived entirely from the moral authority of the old guard, that thin layer of hardened revolutionaries who had earned the trust of the workers through years of struggle. This delicate balance, the ability to withstand fierce internal debate without shattering, was a unique strength of the Bolsheviks, possible only because the party spent years rooting itself deeply in the daily struggles of the working class. A tragic counterexample can be found in the fate of the anarchists in Catalonia during the Spanish Civil War. In July 1936, the CNT-FAI commanded the streets of Barcelona and enjoyed mass support far exceeding what the Bolsheviks held in February 1917. Yet, lacking a disciplined party structure dedicated to the seizure of state power, they refused to establish a worker state, fearing the very concept of dictatorship. The result was not freedom, but a capitulation to the bourgeois government, which eventually regrouped and crushed them. The Bolsheviks survived because they possessed what the Spanish anarchists lacked: organization capable of wielding power rather than just critiquing it. This internal cohesion, however, relies entirely on the material connection between the party and the class. The tragedy of the Russian Revolution lies in the severance of this vital bond. In 1917, the party acted as the vanguard of a class in flood tide. The skeleton was fleshed out by the living proletariat. But this body was annihilated during the Civil War. With industrial output collapsing and the workforce shrinking by millions, workers fleeing to the countryside to avoid starvation or dying at the front, the proletariat became, in Lenin's admission, declassed and dislodged from its class groove. It was against this backdrop of disintegration that the Bolsheviks restricted internal democracy, not to crush the proletariat, but in a desperate bid to preserve the party's proletarian character in its absence. As the exhausted working class retreated from political life, they left behind not a void but a vacuum, rapidly filled by a new social force: careerists and former Tsarist officials seeking status within the state apparatus. This trend was so extreme that by 1920, there were over 5 times as many state administrators as industrial workers. Lenin viewed the 1921 ban on factions as a necessary dam against this rising tide, a way to insulate the revolutionary core of the party from alien class pressures. He utilized this new authority immediately to launch a general purge, expelling nearly a quarter of the membership. Crucially, however, ejected members were merely stripped of party cards, not imprisoned, while opposition leaders remained in high office and continued to debate vigorously throughout Lenin's lifetime. Even at its most desperate, Lenin's leadership was a far cry from the autocracy of Stalin. However, Lenin understood well that organizational purity could not substitute for a living social class indefinitely. For that reason, he dismissed all proposals to ban factions permanently as pointless and excessive. This restriction was not the pinnacle of Bolshevik governance, but a calculated risk against it, a holding action that would pay off only if the Soviet project were revitalized by a successful German revolution. Lenin was starkly realistic about the precarity of this situation, famously declaring, "If the German Revolution does not come, we are doomed." When the German Revolution was put down for good in 1923, Lenin's gamble was decided and the doom he feared soon followed. Without proletarian initiative at home or socialist assistance from abroad, the old guard were left operating state machinery that rapidly mutated into a collective capitalist. Stalin was able to secure power because he, unlike his rivals, accepted this reality and chose to serve it. Promoting a productivist revision of Marxism that falsely equated state management with socialism, he anointed himself the patron of this rising bureaucratic class while maintaining a veneer of revolutionary continuity. In a final, cruel irony, he seized on the ban on factions, meant to shield the party from careerism, and sharpened it into a sword to decapitate the revolutionary generation. By retooling the party from a vanguard of liberation into the ruthless manager of national capital, Stalin did not save the Bolshevik legacy, but liquidated it to entrench the rule of its usurpers. In the ideological vacuum left by the Soviet collapse, the concept of revolution has become systematically equated with tyranny. Faced with this barrage, much of the left has retreated into tepid reformism, while others, reacting against such impotence, have embraced a tragic defense of Stalin's legacy. Thinkers like Domenico Lucerdo argue that political realism demanded leadership like Stalin's, effectively accepting the Cold War lie of an unbroken continuity between 1917 and the Gulag. But as Trotsky famously declared, that continuity was severed by a river of blood, blood spilled from the true heirs of Bolshevism. Bolshevism's legacy resides not in the prosecutors of the Moscow trials, but in its eventual defendants, the intransigent oppositionists who waged a relentless struggle against bureaucratic degeneration. Even after being expelled and hunted, they organized clandestine factory cells, distributed underground bulletins exposing the regime's betrayal, and led hunger strikes within the very gulags designed to silence them. From the shop floors of 1928 to the frozen isolation cells of Vorkuta in the late 1930s, they kept the flame of 1917 alive until they were physically exterminated. Yes, they were defeated. Lucerdo is right to claim that material relations of force were overwhelmingly in the bureaucracy's favor, and that in this sense, the opposition fought for an unworkable utopianism. But as one of the bureaucracy's earliest opponents, Vladimir Sorin, put it, "It is preferable to lose at the hand of outside forces as a true proletarian power than to survive by adapting to the circumstances, by eschewing communist principles and allowing the Soviet power to degenerate until nothing of it remains but its external shell." By refusing to capitulate, the opposition succeeded in the only task left to them, preserving the clean banner of international socialism. However painful the defeat, and however tempting the alternative, no other banner is worth rallying behind.